Hi, I'm Enrico Guarini, faculty member at the University of Milano-Bicocca. In this webinar, we are going to explore some important issues for the governance of research infrastructures. This webinar is part of RI Train, the Research Infrastructure Training Program, an EU-funded Horizon 2020 research project. To explore this topic, we are here with Ivan Baines, Chief Operating Officer at Max Planck Institute in Dresden. Ivan has over 30 years experience in setting up and working with the large-scale research infrastructure. So Ivan, thank you for sharing your knowledge on this topic. Before starting, can you give us some description about Max Planck Institute in terms of legal status, activities and funding model?
Sure, Enrico. Well, first, thanks very much for the invitation, and it's good to be here. The Max Planck Institute is the organization for basic research in Germany. It's around about 23,000 people in over 80 institutes, including some institutes now in other countries. I was actually involved in the setting up of the first Max Planck Research Institute in the US, in Florida, for neuroscience. So it's now the Max Planck itself is organized, given that we will be addressing the issue of governance, it's organized as a cooperative, which is similar to a tennis club or a football club, which means that its legal authority resides in its members. The members are the scientific directors of the research institutes. So a core principle of the Max Planck Society is a scientific research organization led by scientists.
Okay, moving to the topic of this webinar, which is governance. Can we start by defining what does governance mean to you?
Sure. First of all, maybe just to illustrate the issue of governance in the context of RIs. I like to say that if you have 400 people in a company, you hope that they think with one brain. That brings the most power to a particular product line. So you want harmony and you want convergence of process and thought. If you have 400 people in a research institute, you hope that they think with entirely independent brains, because that's the maximum chance of discovery. But it also provides a unique challenge with regard to organization and governance. So governance is both, this is very important, it's both the interactions and the process by which decisions are made. And often it's the interactions themselves which in an academic environment are more important than the process, because as we know, academics generally are not terribly, they may be resistant to being put into a corporate structure or to following rules and procedures. So therefore, the interactions by which a decision is made becomes critical, because you have to get buy-in, you have to get some kind of unity of purpose in order to achieve anything in an academic environment.
We can discuss about this point later. I would want to ask you if you can describe some typical roles, governance roles in research infrastructure, and if there are any peculiarities in comparison with corporate structures.
So RIs are between a typical academic environment and a corporate structure. The reason they're between is they are not performing independent research. The organic unit is no longer a research group or research lab. It's actually a infrastructure, and it's an organizational and operational and financial model to support a broader number, a larger portion of the research community. So in fact, it has an agenda, which means that it needs to be structured, it needs to be professionalized. But at the same time, it has to retain the trust of its user base. So it has to be academic in the way it operates, and it has to prioritize research. So if you like, the unique challenge of RIs are that they must be professionally managed, they must be equally accessible to all their users, otherwise they will lose trust. It must be transparent how they're governed, what are the rules of access, how are they financed. If these things aren't achieved, one will not secure the buy-in of the community. So I suppose a key difference and a key challenge is you don't have corporate authority behind you to top-down instruct what will happen. Rather, you have only the powers of your persuasion, a consultative process with the user community, and then to try and build something which is of such value to them that they will buy into it. So I would say it's more challenging in many ways than a corporate infrastructure. The only advantage is it doesn't necessarily or will rarely be profitable.
Okay, so this is a very interesting point to me. But I'm very curious to ask you, in terms of governance structures, a governance model to be effective, it requires a legal leadership who has the authority to take the decision. So I understand the importance of a consultative process, but of course you have to define some rules within the governance structure. So what about the autonomy of management role?
So I think you've touched on a very important point. I think the rules can protect an RI from abuse. They can define how you may access it. They can require, for example, that you have to have an orientation. You may have to get, in effect, a driving license in order to have access to a very sophisticated piece of instrumentation. So you do have to have rules. But in order to actually get buy-in, the rules don't secure the buy-in of the user community, only the consultative process. And here, only if the various user stakeholders in the RI see the benefit of the RI to their own research will they buy into it and support it. There are a number of bodies which are very important. You could have a supervisory board, you could have a scientific advisory board, you could have a steering committee of users, typically, or you could have all of those things. They have different roles. A supervisory body must basically is responsible for providing the financing and getting reports and making the management, RI management, accountable for both the performance of the RI and its financial operations. A scientific advisory board makes sure it remains state-of-the-art and innovative and responds to new technologies that may appear. The steering committee makes sure that it continues to serve its user communities, and they are typically, larger RIs have many different user communities, and the RI is positioned in the center of those respective communities' interests. But you have to balance them, otherwise you'll lose a whole community from supporting that RI. I mean, just to give you an example, the S3 program Eurobioimaging was brought together the medical imaging community and the advanced light microscopy imaging community. Those have very different agendas and needs. In order to provide an infrastructure solution, both sets of agendas need to be clearly represented in the common agenda, otherwise it will not be successful.
So what's the major challenge for the governance of a research infrastructure in this perspective?
The major challenge is that it's operating in an academic environment. If you like, the 400 independent brains, which leads to a certain amount of chaos. It's not, organization and structure are not part of the culture of academic research. This means that really establishing those rules of access, how you run the instruments, there are very, very strong opinions provided by the users. Many of the users are senior PIs, and some of those senior PIs are represented in the governance. So you also have to make sure that no one is throwing their weight around at a senior level to prejudice the RI towards their own particular interests, because then you will lose the support of other significant stakeholders. So I think, again, the governance here is making sure that all the respective stakeholder agendas are represented in the governance bodies.
So I understand that different stakeholders have different expectations and different agendas. So the question is how to achieve the unity of purpose that you mentioned before. Is it a matter of rules or process? What's your experience about that?
I think it's absolutely it's an outcome of a process. So, and that is the consultative process. The rules will not achieve that unity of purpose. in order to achieve a unity of purpose, one must consult with all of the different user communities. Again, just to illustrate this point, there are, from the scientific side, there were strategic stakeholders who tend to be the senior PIs or institute directors who may want to push the profile of their institute to be seen to be using more state-of-the-art technology. On the other hand, the users may be very content with the technology they're already using and they're already familiar with it. So bringing those two agendas together can be a challenge. Then on the other side, you have the funders or whoever is financing the infrastructure, and they're hoping to see some improvement in cost effectiveness or availability or accessibility. So you have multiple agendas. So in this regard, you have a consultative process, you have to define the different agendas, and then you have to try and work out what is the common agenda, and is that realistic in terms of what an RI could provide to the different expectations from the different stakeholder groups.
On this point, can you describe a critical situation that you've addressed and what suggestion for a RI manager?
So I can give you maybe actually two examples. One is, again, from Eurobioimaging. As a member of the project management team, we had the challenge of defining what is the legal nature of a hub. In other words, who could be eligible to apply as a Eurobioimaging hub? The advanced light microscopy community wanted to define a hub as a single legal entity for very clear and very reasonable justifications. For example, to disperse funds in order to establish procedures, in order to have even statutes. It is necessary, if you like, to have a single legal entity. But this was unacceptable to the medical imaging community because medical programs span multiple legal entities. Often even university medical faculty have joint appointments with the private clinic which is associated with the medical faculty. So you simply cannot have it restricted to single legal entities. So this created a complete rift because, of course, who is eligible to become a hub defines who will receive funding. So this is a very also emotional point. How was it solved? It was solved by basically agreeing that you could have multiple legal entities so long as they could sign an agreement that allowed them to operate as a single legal entity when it came to disbursement of funds and all of the actions required to be a Eurobioimaging hub.
What's the role of the manager in this perspective?
Well, in this case, this is, if you like, in the preparative phase of an S3 program, and the infrastructure doesn't yet exist. I think the role of the manager is to secure the trust of each stakeholder group. If they come from one community, they have extra work to secure the trust of the other community to show that they will represent this community's interests equally to the community from which they came themselves. So I think the role of the RI manager is always to be fully transparent, to be fair, to make sure that whatever is built is equally accessible to all, and that all opinions are heard equally. And then you secure the trust. If this is not the case and the community doesn't trust it, they will not buy in.
And apart from the process, which is very important in the consultation stage, in terms of the structure, are there any stakeholders that must be represented in the structure?
Absolutely. I think, quite frankly, that every stakeholder needs to be represented in the governance structure in some form or another. So, for example, the funders and the politicians are will be resistant to providing sustained funding unless they have some representation in the governance structure. You don't want to pour financing into something where you have no influence on its decision making. Then there's a question of sort of ownership. The senior strategic stakeholders from the scientific side want to have influence on the direction and the nature, keeping it state-of-the-art, and what technologies are included, what techniques, what profile of activities. They want to be represented in the decision-making structure. The users themselves feel that their needs are not being properly understood or addressed unless they can also be at the table and to give their opinion. So I think, yes, you have to consider that, that every stakeholder should be represented.
If you use a metaphor from the basketball, can we say that the manager is both the trainer and the playmaker of the game?
Well, I'm not an expert on basketball, but I think that's a reasonable analogy. In other words, what you're suggesting is that you both design the game plan, so you design where you position your players, and so the basic structure of the team, but then you want to also elaborate a strategy by which they can be successful. With regard to RIs, yes, you need to define the structure, you need to define all the key stakeholders, all the players, but then you have to work out the operational model, the organizational and governance structure, the financial model in order for it to be successful. So if you like, the strategy. And all the time making sure you're doing good science, that the users appreciate the extra value offered by the RI.
I have another question at this point. It's related to financing research infrastructure at the national and international level. So the question is, who owns research infrastructure? Who is responsible for them and who pays for what?
Very interesting question, Enrico, because I think if you asked the user communities, they would say, well, it's the responsibility of the governments as the owner of the RI to continue to finance them. If you ask the governments, they will say, no, the RI is owned by the user community. We are just getting it started, and it's up to you guys to work out how to maintain its sustainability. Of course, the truth is somewhere in the middle. Both are important, but my answer will be a little bit different. Basically, the purpose of the RI, and I've introduced the concept of purpose in a different webinar, but basically that's its scientific reason for being. Its purpose is owned by the user community, by the scientists. Its intent, what is the problem it's trying to solve, which could be making something more cost-effective, that is owned by the governmental or funders, the funding stakeholders. And finally, really, from a legal perspective, who owns it is the hosting institution, because it's, in the end, infrastructure, buildings, equipment, and so on, and someone must purchase them. And they're typically purchased via the hosting institution. So from a legal perspective, the hosting institution may own it.
So just a few words to close this very interesting conversation. Can you summarize some key learning points for a manager of a research infrastructure, according to your experience in governance?
Yes, I think achieving a unity of purpose by a consultative process with the user community is an absolutely essential part. Implementing the organizational structure with a governance model that secures the trust of the different stakeholders is absolutely critical. With a good governance and organizational model, one has the trust of the user community, and they will buy into it because they feel that their personal agenda is fairly represented. Now, if you went to the next aspect of I think that the long-term sustainability requires very, very strong commitments from the side of the funders with regard to the intent, because in the end, no RI can truly be fully self-sustaining. It may be that its operations can be fully self-sustaining, but then replacing the infrastructure when it ages in 15 or 20 years, that is a major challenge. If the costs of all of the equipment and all of the infrastructure, the depreciation costs, are not underwritten by the national or international combination of governmental bodies that are supporting it, then the RI would have to achieve all of that in its access fees or recharge model. It would be prohibitively expensive. So there has to be an understanding that it's the most cost-effective way of providing access to that technology, so the governments are providing finances in a more cost-effective way, so it's an improvement for them, but they should nevertheless understand that the basic infrastructure itself, but not its operations. But the infrastructure will need to be supported by them in a long-term commitment.
So Ivan, thank you very much for this very interesting conversation, and thank you again for sharing your knowledge on this topic.
Well, thank you, Enrico. It's been an interesting interview. Thank you.